First two games of the day are the elimination matches, unlike yesterday, so we'll be doing those first. First up, we have Digital Chaos versus Vici Gaming Reborn. In Game 1, Vici picked interesting lineup. Not one that we've seen have a lot of success in this tournament. They picked a lineup where you delay. They picked 4 heroes to cause a bunch of damage in the early to mid game. They picked End, a Morphling, and the plan was for him to get to a stage where he was completely unbeatable by the mostly mid-game focused team of Digital Chaos. Well, they picked a bunch of heroes that win your early game with Dragon Knight, Trading Farm, very difficult to zone out a Tide Hunter, and the support combo of Vengeful Spirit and Bounty Hunter with the goal of disrupting the lanes of Digital Chaos. Unfortunately, that didn't work as DC picked a bunch of very survivable heroes, and with the Lich pick as their last pick, they did a very good job of cementing their lanes, making it very difficult for the Bounty Hunter to get anything done. They won all their lanes, and Morphling not having enough space to become that unbeatable force, they just got run over. DC takes Game 1. Game 2 was a complete disaster for DC. Vici picked a lineup that was incredibly tanky and interested in early game aggression with the patented MVP Phoenix strat of the Bristleback IO. It was too much for Digital Chaos to handle. They lost all of their lanes. They only had 2 total kills. It was a complete disaster. Vici Gaming takes Game 2. After the stomp in Game 2, DC returned to what worked for them in the first game with a bunch of very survivable lanes, with 4 cores farming, with Misery playing the Jungle Beastmaster. They wanted to, again, collect as much farm as they could in the first 20 minutes and then have a very strong mid-game. There was some great movements from FY on his Earth Spirit and great counter ganks from DDC that allowed them to manage their way through the early game to a point where they could push with the incredibly high damage in the mid-game of a farmed Death Prophet and Terrorblade. The game dragged out 45 minutes, but it was done much earlier than that. Unfortunately, Resolution on his Clinks was unable to do enough damage. DC loses the game and is eliminated from the tournament. Next game up was LGD versus Empire. This is again an elimination match. LGD does the best lineup I've seen all tournament with the all-red strat, really trying to those team colors. MMY got a ridiculously early Blink Dagger, I think at like 13 minutes, with the 4 heroes farming, having September play in the off lane on the Phoenix while you're having a very quick jungle Beastmaster. They were able to accrue enough gold that the mid-game damage that Empire was trying to face was not due to the tanking nature of the Dragon Knight and Beastmaster and the farm that they had gotten earlier, which Empire was unexpecting. They took a couple of very strong mid-game teamfights by LGD. Eventually they took a massive Roche win, and they did a very smart job of pushing slowly and stably as we know that LGD is famous for. This game in particular highlighted the mix of old and new school Chinese Dota with the very aggressive mid-game from Aggressive and Maybe, and then the controlled aggression with the slow push, starving your enemy out of the jungle, collecting Roshans. You saw from Xiao in his LGD take Game 1. In Game 2, we saw a very awkward laning setup from Team Empire where they decided that they wanted to safe lane the Beastmaster and off lane the Face Void. Unfortunately for them, as we've seen a couple of times in this tournament, the roaming Riki was not nearly as effective as it needed to be, and Scandal had a horrible game on Puck, very out of character. Effectively, this really does come down to a outdraft, as the much more standard laning setup of LGD was executed much better, much safer, and eventually the farmed Ember Spirit and the Lycan were too much for the mid-game magic burst that Empire was banking on up to this point. They lost the game. They were eliminated. This feels like a scenario where Team Empire felt like they were outclassed by skill and were thus forced to do something outside of the box. Did not pan out. I'm not sure if this is the case, as Empire does have a lot of skill, but they ended up moving away from the aggression that had got them so far up to this point. Putting Ramses on a Beastmaster seems like a very strange choice. Ended up not working. Considering this is their first big tournament as a team, they showed some serious promise. The last 2 games of the day are upper bracket games, therefore there was no eliminations in these ones. First up, we have MVP versus OG. In Game 1, OG picked an incredibly survivable lineup with 2 healing supports in the Dazzle and the IO, as well as a DK and a Beastmaster. This was very similar to the strat that LGD attempted to run in Game 1 of the previous series. For OG, they executed it much better. Miracle did his fantastic thing where he always manages to find farm. Everyone else was able to create enough space for him in the first 20 minutes that by the time it hit 20 minutes, he had enough farm and enough kills that he could easily take fights that you would not expect a Morphling at this point in time to take. MVP Phoenix did not stray from their typical success. They played a very aggressive lineup with Forev on the Axe and MP playing on the Juggernaut. Unfortunately, the roaming from Bounty Hunter ended up not being as successful as they needed it to be to get that snowball where they got to a point where they could burst through the large HP pools of the OG lineup at an early enough point. Additionally, QO did not get enough help in the mid and was just wrecked. Because of the choice to run a roaming bounty hunter, there was no one that was able to really help QO in the same way that Fly did on the OG side. Game 2, MVP decided that they wanted to not change their strategy and did a very similar thing, picking a lot of aggressive heroes, putting QO on his very successful Slardar that we had seen at Shanghai, and put MP, one of the paramount Invoker players, on the Wizard. Unfortunately for them, they got 0 kills. It was a complete outplay. Miracle crushed mid on his TA. All the other lanes managed to do exactly what they needed to, and the mid-game physical burst damage from the TA and the Sven was far too much. Again, as we saw yesterday, Crit playing on the Elder Titan, just sitting mid the entire time, was super successful for them this time. OG wins game 2, MVP is knocked down to the lower bracket. This is going to be the last series of the day. Newbie versus Fnatic. Again, this is an upper bracket match, so there are no eliminations. In game 1, this really ended up just simply being a miscommunication of ideas between Fnatic. Fnatic picked a very strong team fighting lineup with the potential to transition into split push at a later stage in the game. Newbie picked 4 cores and just farmed for the first 15 minutes. This is a very passive early game. Once Newbie hit that threshold of farm where they felt like they could take fights against this very strong Fnatic lineup, they started to utilize their incredibly mobile lineup to get pickoffs and then transition that pickoff into a very strong push with Death Prophet, Weaver, Beastmaster. What this really comes down to is that while Fnatic's 5-on-5 fight was incredibly strong, Newbie was always able to have a numbers advantage and therefore win almost every fight. Additionally, it was a very strange item choice from Mushi. He went BKB early on SF, which is completely fine in this game, I think. However, it did not seem to have any synergy with the rest of his team as Phantom Lancer picked up an early Boots of Travel, and Ohio on his Nature's Prophet decided to go Maelstrom and Aghanims. It seemed like half of their team wanted to split push and Mushi wanted to fight. Unfortunately, this jive just didn't happen. They lost game 1. In game 2, Newbie picked A4 Protect 1, a strat that we have not seen have great success, and we saw that horrific game yesterday in the Alliance versus Na'Vi series where they had a lead on Naga and they ended up losing it. Fnatic decided to pick this mid-physical burst lineup where they would hit a timing in the mid-game, get a bunch of bursts, and be able to push very quickly with their Nature's Prophet as well as the physical damage from the TA and the Slark. In the early game, it was fairly even. Everything was looking fine. Unfortunately, Fnatic must have felt that there was a clock. They began taking teamfights that were disadvantageous. Newbie played very safe, survived the late game where they felt like they were the strongest. It took a couple of great fights, and then Mushi got caught out, died back, and at that point, the game was simply over. Fnatic is knocked down to the lower bracket. Newbie moves. It should be noted that Newbie and OG, I think, are looking like the 2 strongest teams in the tournament at this point. Admittedly, most of this has been down to fantastic drafting on both sides. If we see an even matchup from captains, it's possible that we end up with a more even game. I look forward to seeing that. Talking about today's trends, we saw that picking safe wins game. This has been in contrast to a couple of more interesting cheese strats or very strong meta picks that have won games in these last couple of days. It should also be noted that counter picking is actually making a pretty big difference, not on a hero basis, but in a strat countering way. We have seen very few games where both teams pick a very similar strat, and instead we've seen a lot of ideas of teams trying to counter the other with vastly different plays. Typically, one focuses on pushing and the other focuses on team fighting. Push strats just have not been working out, as we've seen a lot of death balls fail a single high ground push and then just get wrecked by overwhelming team fight. Tomorrow we have another 3 matches, all elimination. Are moving very close to the end of the tournament. If I remember correctly, there is not a day break in between the semis and the grand final, so that should be good to see. A couple of really great games. Unfortunately, today ended up having a couple more stomps than we saw yesterday. It's interesting to note that there is a very large number of teams from China after the Shanghai Major's colossal failure where there was almost no success from that region. They've fought back and have become relevant, or maybe the Western scene is just getting weaker. I'm not really sure. See you guys tomorrow. Later.
And now the somebody say, could you pick it up far? But and I am sick, but I don't. That's so cool. How do you do that? I'm geeking out right now. I could